Welkom allemaal aanwezigen hier in de zaal. Welkom ook luisteraars in de livestream. Mijn naam is Linda Hovius. Ik ben de voorzitter van de Hollandse Maatschappij. En namens mijn medebestuursleden en alle medewerkers hier heet ik u van harte welkom bij deze feestelijke middag, waar we 4 prijzen mogen uitreiken. En dat gaan we met veel plezier doen. Voor degenen van u die de Hollandse Maatschappij niet kennen, de KHMW, Koninklijke Hollandse Maatschappij der Wetenschappen. Wij zijn het oudste geleerde genootschap in Nederland, opgericht in 1752, de tijd van de verlichting, toen een aantal vooraanstaande Haarlemmers eigenlijk wilden kijken hoe ze de wetenschap konden betrekken bij de problemen van de samenleving van dat moment. En daartoe schreven zij prijsvragen uit. En we hebben nog steeds, reiken wij heel veel prijzen uit voor wetenschappelijke prestaties, variërend van de beste eerstejaars in alle studierichtingen tot en met Oeuvreprijzen. En naast het uitreiken van prijzen doen we ook van alles om de brug tussen wetenschap en samenleving te slaan, door allerlei discussies te organiseren, debatsessies, lezingen, waar onze leden, die bestaan voor de helft uit wetenschappelijke leden, hoogleraren, en voor de helft uit mensen uit het maatschappelijk veld, bedrijfsleven, overheid, not-for-profit, die komen hier bij elkaar om ervaringen uit te wisselen, inzichten te delen en op die manier ook die brug tussen wetenschap en samenleving zo stevig mogelijk te laten zijn. Dat is de missie van de Hollandse Maatschappij. En dat doen we dus al sinds 1752 en nog steeds is die missie springlevend. Ik wil voor vandaag heel graag speciaal welkom heten. En by the way, I do most of this in Dutch, but Rafael, when we get to you, we'll switch to English, don't worry. But I hope you'll get the gist of everything we do here, even if it's in Dutch. Yeah. We hebben dus een aantal laureaten, 4, die ik van harte welkom wil heten. Felicia Loecherbach, Felicia zit hier, sorry, ja. Rafael, Escamilla, Gonzalez, Aragon, hier. Francien, Bossema, die zit daar. En professor Dr. Wouter Hanegraaff, hier voor mij. Dus heel fijn dat jullie er zijn om deze eervolle prijs in ontvangst te nemen. En dan wil ik ook graag de aanwezige juryleden van harte welkom heten, want zonder die juryleden die heel veel werk verzetten, zouden wij nooit tot deze geweldige prijswinnaars kunnen komen. Professor Dr. Sjoerd Beugelsdijk, professor Dr. Kees Koedijk, ik weet niet waar iedereen zit, maar professor Dr. Kees Hengeveld, professor Dr. Aafke Komter, die zit daar, en professor Dr. James McAllister, van harte welkom en aan u en al uw mede-juryleden bij deze vast een heel hartelijk dankwoord voor al het werk wat jullie hebben verzet. En dan hebben we ook de secretaris van de Dr. Elizabeth Schram Mully Foundation, de heer Kees Hogenboom, die een van deze prijzen mogelijk maakt. We zitten hier, ik vertelde al iets over de KHMW, we zitten hier in het Hodshonhuis. Een van de prijzen is ook vernoemd naar Keetje Hodshon. Zij was een heel jong wees geworden jonge dame, die eind 18e eeuw met het fortuin wat zij van haar overleden ouders had geërfd, het Hodshonhuis heeft laten bouwen, een stadspaleis hier aan het Spaarne in Haarlem, waar u bent ontvangen, het trappenhuis en de stijlkamers die u wellicht allemaal gezien heeft. Dat was haar woonhuis en ze heeft daar heel lang gewoond, tot haar overlijden. Daarna is dit de domicilie geworden van de KHMW, die ook al in Haarlem zetelde, maar op een andere locatie. Maar sinds 1841 bewonen wij dit fantastische Hodshonhuis. En alleen waren de stijlkamers werden te klein op een gegeven moment voor de grote ontvangsten. En toen is deze aula bijgebouwd eind 19e eeuw om dit soort grote bijeenkomsten ook te kunnen faciliteren. En daar maken we nog steeds met heel erg veel plezier en dankbaarheid gebruik van. Want hoe mooi is het om hier op deze historische plek in het hart van Haarlem deze feestelijke ontvangsten te kunnen doen. Graag ga ik over tot de aankondiging van de eerste prijs. Ik zei al, dat is de KHMW Keetje Hodshon Proefschriftprijs voor de Geesteswetenschappen. En die is bestemd dit jaar voor een proefschrift in de taal- en communicatiewetenschappen. Deze prijs bestaat al sinds 1981, maar sinds 1994 hebben we hem naar Keetje Hodshon genoemd om haar ook in de vorm van een prijs te laten voortbestaan, niet alleen in de vorm van dit huis. Voor deze prijs zijn dit jaar 25 voordrachten aan de jury voorgelegd. En die jury bestond uit professor Dr. Milen Bonte, hoogleraar Cognitive Neuroscience of Language and Literacy Development aan de Universiteit van Maastricht, professor Dr. Kees Hengeveld, hoogleraar Theoretische Taalwetenschap aan de Universiteit van Amsterdam, en professor Dr. Rens Vliegendhart, hoogleraar Strategische Communicatie in Wageningen. Graag zou ik jurylid Kees Hengeveld naar voren willen vragen om de laudatio uit te spreken. En Felicia, misschien wil je nog even blijven zitten terwijl Kees het woord tot jou richt, zodat hij jou ook kan aankijken tijdens het uitspreken van de laudatio. En daarna roepen we jou naar voren. Kees, graag aan jou het woord.
De KHMW Keetje Hodshonprijs voor de Geesteswetenschappen was, zoals gezegd, in 2025 gereserveerd voor onderzoek op het gebied van de taal- en communicatiewetenschappen. Zoals ook al gezegd, er was een verheugend groot aantal voordrachten voor de prijs, maar liefst 25 proefschriften werden genomineerd. En hoewel de grens niet zo makkelijk te trekken is, lag ongeveer een derde van die proefschriften op het terrein van de communicatiewetenschappen, 2/3 op het terrein van de taalwetenschappen. En dan binnen die laatste categorie lag dan weer ongeveer de helft op het terrein van de neuro- en de psycholinguïstiek en de andere helft op het terrein van de taalstructuur. Ondanks het grote aantal inzendingen van uitstekende kwaliteit werd de jury het opvallend eenvoudig eens over welk proefschrift de prijs zou moeten krijgen. Namelijk dat van Felicia Loecherbach, met als titel Diversity of News Consumption in a Digital Information Environment. Dit proefschrift is zowel wat betreft theoretisch kader, de gebruikte methodologie, de wetenschappelijke en de maatschappelijke impact en de leesbaarheid zonder meer uitstekend te noemen. In haar proefschrift, dat zij schreef aan de Vrije Universiteit van Amsterdam, onderzoekt Felicia Loecherbach de zeer actuele vraag welke impact de veranderingen in het medialandschap hebben op de diversiteit van de nieuwsconsumptie. Zij ontwikkelt hiervoor haar eigen theoretische kader. Dat is een aangepaste versie van het Diversity Chain Model. Dat maakt ze geschikt voor onderzoek van digitale nieuwsconsumptie. De methodologieën die ze gebruikt zijn zonder meer origineel te noemen. Zo maakt ze gebruik van datadonaties, waarbij proefpersonen hun browsergeschiedenis met haar delen. Ze ontwikkelde ook een eigen app voor een online veldexperiment. Om zo te kunnen bepalen welke rol algoritmische aanbevelingssystemen in de diversiteit van nieuwsconsumptie spelen. Lovenswaardig vond de jury ook dat zij deze app ter beschikking heeft gesteld van de wetenschappelijke gemeenschap. Het proefschrift is ook nog eens uitermate helder geschreven. De belangrijkste bevindingen laten zien dat fragmentatie leidt tot een minder diverse nieuwsconsumptie, terwijl personalisatie juist zorgt voor een meer niche-gerichte en meer diverse consumptie. De dissertatie concludeert dat de digitale omgeving de manier waarop mensen nieuws volgen fundamenteel heeft veranderd. Onderzoek naar mediadiversiteit moet in de toekomst sterker rekening houden met deze veranderingen. Vanuit maatschappelijk perspectief is dit proefschrift hoogst relevant. In een tijd waarin de kwaliteit van nieuws soms moeilijk te verifiëren is en algoritmische systemen worden toegepast die nieuws filteren naar gebruiker, is aandacht voor die mediadiversiteit meer dan ooit belangrijk. Vanuit al deze perspectieven is dit proefschrift de KHMW Keetje Hodshon Proefschriftprijs voor de Geesteswetenschappen 2025 zonder meer waardig. We kennen de prijs dan ook graag toe aan Dr. Felicia Loecherbach en feliciteren niet alleen haar, maar ook haar begeleiders. professor Dr. Wouter van Attenveld, professor Dr. Judith Muller en Dr. Damian Trilling met deze bijzondere prestatie. Dank u wel.
Dan wil ik ook graag Wim naar voren roepen, onze secretaris Geestes- en Maatschappijwetenschappen, om deze prijs aan jou te overhandigen. Ja, even kijken. En dit is... ja, sorry. Wij hebben een oorkonde en achterop een envelop met wat je gaat krijgen. En dan hebben we nog, even kijken, de zilveren penning van de KHMW, die bij deze prijs, aan deze prijs verbonden is. En nou, aan jou de eer. Zal ik het hier voor je overnemen? Ja. Ik leg het hier neer. En dan nodigen we je graag uit om ons iets te vertellen over jouw proefschrift en onderzoek. Ja.
Oké. Ja, nou, hallo allemaal. Ik voel me zeer vereerd om deze prijs te krijgen, maar ik ga mijn presentatie wel in het Engels doen, want anders gaat het heel lang duren. So here we are. You already heard a little bit in the laudatio about my dissertation. It's called Diversity of News Consumption in a Digital Information Environment. First of all, it's very common putting very big pictures of people on slides. So these are the faces to who you just heard, my supervision team at the VU in Amsterdam. We, I think, made a really nice dissertation together, even though there was a pandemic in between, and sort of trying to figure out a lot of things that actually became pretty relevant exactly during that time. But now talking a little bit about my dissertation. So it's about diversity in a digital news environment. So there's two different parts. On the one hand, you can ask, well, why would we care about diversity and what is it? So there are different kinds. So for example, if you're thinking, people can think that climate change is a very important topic. People can think immigration is a very important topic. Or maybe you're not into politics and you think it's very annoying that Bayern München won the Bundesliga again. And sort of depending on what kind of news you see and the topic diversity that you see, you find different things in society very important or not important. And if we all see very different topics, this can lead to a fragmented public sphere. We have different ideas of what is now the pressing topic of the time. Do we now need to care about immigration? Do we need to care about sports? So this is about topic diversity. But even if we all care about the same topic, the actors we can get our news from, so the actor diversity is also very important. Do you listen to right-wing podcaster Joe Rogan about immigration? Or do you listen to activists, to youth activists when they're talking about immigration? Depending on what you're hearing there, you actually might get a little bit more misinformation. I might have also made a statement there who might be more in charge of misinformation here in this case. And then lastly, it's also about the diversity of viewpoints. So when you're hearing immigration, are you often hearing about we got to close the borders, we got to protect ourselves? Are you hearing about openness and diversity? So depending on the kind of viewpoints you're seeing, you might also actually become more polarized in your opinion. You got very afraid that you got to close the borders. So as you can see, diversity is sort of, it's a very abstract concept. It always sounds very fluffy and interesting, but it actually is part of almost all of the challenges that we have. So it really comes down to what kind of information is a person seeing at a given point in time. And this is then where the digital information environment comes in. What do I mean by that? Well, when I was born, it was very unusual to have a personal computer. If we're thinking about it, so in 2020, and that's already way in the past, basically, people on average had 6 connected devices. So you have it in your car, you have it in your fridge, you have it on your phone, you have it on your TV, you have it everywhere. So there's a lot of different devices that people are using, and that makes it difficult for users, but that also makes it very difficult for researchers because we gotta sort of find an idea of where people are getting their news, because we can't just rely on typical mass media and on newspapers or television, for example. And we also have more content. The internet is growing. And this content is from more reliable or less reliable sources. It's from official sources, less official sources. We're basically drowning in content. And we can only make sense of all of this content if we start filtering it. And there's a lot of different options how we can filter content. We can make a lot of choices. We can decide what websites and what information to visit and to consume. But we are more and more also starting to outsource this. So we have algorithms that do this for you. And they learn what we like, and they start filtering content in a way that is nice for us. So all of these different things come together, and they are characteristics of what I'm calling a digital information environment. And ultimately, I then ended up at asking the questions, well, okay, so we have the concept of diversity, which has been studied a lot. It is a very established concept. We have this new media information environment. What happens when we put those two together? So this is what I started out with, and then you can see a little asterisk, because while I was working on it, I then also had a different question that kind of practically came. How on earth are we supposed to research this? And that, especially for the first half of the dissertation, became like a fairly big struggle. And sort of this is also why the first studies are not as empirical as normally in my field you would expect a dissertation to be. Yeah, and as you will come to see, I am a fan of conveying meaning with memes and words. So this is indeed, I think, at least the first 2 to 3 years of my dissertation, me trying to explain the world and how it all comes together. During my dissertation, I did 4 very different studies, and I'll very quickly run through them. So the first one was a systematic literature review, because when I started out, I sort of at some point realized the question, but what is media or news diversity, is actually a very complex one, and it has been answered very differently in different fields. So I went through the literature across different disciplines and tried to figure out, okay, what has been studied and also which parts are most affected by the changes in the information environment that we have. Out of that, I took a couple different things, but I think the main 2 things is, on the one hand, what I already mentioned, that most studies focus very much on one platform and one device. So they are saying, how much diversity do you see in political news on Facebook? And it makes a lot of sense, because that is something that is easy to study, but it just doesn't take into account that probably this is 5 minutes out of your day. And during the rest of the day, you're seeing a lot of other, maybe conflicting, very different information. So we gotta do better at sort of getting at that complexity, although it is very complicated. And then secondly, I also saw that a lot of studies are not taking into account that diversity is also an inherently interactive concept. So it used to be that you read the newspaper, and the newspaper doesn't change after you read it. TikTok does. So when you're staying on a video, you're liking a video, you get more of the same. However, it might also be that at some point it's too much of the same, and you dislike it, or you say, I want to have less, and then it goes back. So it actually reacts to the things you're doing. It's very interactive, and it changes and develops over time. And we gotta take that more into account now that we're not thinking about the mass media age anymore. So the second study then was that I was like, okay, I've now understood the challenges theoretically, how about getting at it practically? And then it turned out that is also very complicated, because to take into account all this complexity, you also need to be able to actually capture, I was mostly focusing on the digital realm, what people are doing online. So I actually surveyed and made a toolkit of all the different ways that you can use, or like the different methods that you can apply to gather these digital traces across different devices. And turns out mobile phones are really hard to track, at least if you're sticking to ethical, scientific methods and everything. Essentially, I went through a lot of different methods, and there are quite a few, but what I mostly ended up with, and was already mentioned before, is so-called data donation. It basically sort of it's based on the fact that we all leave digital footprints and digital traces wherever we go. And there are also possibilities to retrieve those. So either these are on our devices or they are at companies such as Meta, such as TikTok, and we can actually ask those companies to get these types of digital traces. So what we're asking people is to sort of mine their own data and give it to us so that we can do research with it. And they are doing this all with consent, ethically, we're not tracking, etc. So that's the nice thing about data donations. After having established that, I actually felt ready to do some empirical research with it, and I also used the method of data donation to indeed have people give me their browsing histories, which they did. I still find that very interesting. I wanted to basically just sort of research where do people find news and information, and especially sort of having a wider idea of what news and information is. Because apart from, going to the Volkskrant or to Telegraaf, there's of course a lot of different ways where you can find information and sort of broader conceptualization. The problem is this broader conceptualization is pretty hard to find automatically. So basically what I did was to be like, okay, I'm gonna go through it manually. So I actually did analyze all the different websites in our sample and checked whether they have something sort of called newsworthiness. That doesn't depend on has a journalist written this, but rather is there a potential for sort of societally relevant information. I don't know if anyone knows this meme. I think it's my favorite, because you then actually have to do all the work. So once I was done, I actually realized why no one is doing this, because it's an absolute pain. But hopefully it was worth it. So what I basically found is that people find news in places we don't expect it, but also the other way around. So if you go to the New York Times, often people immediately categorize this as I'm going to the news. But of course, in this case, you're learning that New York has reached peak pork. Like we're using these newspapers for a lot of things where we're saying, okay, the societal relevance is questionable. Same way, maybe you're going to US Weekly and you hear about climate change mitigation because that's what Kim Kardashian talked about. So there's also a lot of news hidden in places that we're actually not looking at immediately as researchers. And here, the main relevant thing is the red thing is not news. So people are not using the internet for news a lot unless they are as obsessed with news and politics as we researchers are. So I found this, but also a little bit that there is some fragmentation. So that means that there is websites that only one person in my sample went to because it's their local newspaper. But overall, if people go to news, it's still fairly centralized. So the big players, AD, Telegraaf, etc., do still dominate. There's not that much in the fringes. So remember, I did all of this to find the fringes. That's why I looked at all of them, only to ultimately conclude didn't find that much. So this is a bit sort of to empirically check, okay, where can we find diversity in news today? And then lastly, I also wanted to know a little bit more about personalization. So these are the algorithms that everyone's talking about. You might have heard the term filter bubble before. But what I wanted to do is basically build a news website. So this is, I think, one of the earlier versions. I called it 3x3 because it is 3x3 news. And this is a website that live injects news from all kinds of different news outlets. So these are real, actual news. But because they are in such a sort of artificial environment, I can control the personalization. And I use different algorithms, but I also used it that people can have a choice. So they can change the website and change the diversity of topics that they're seeing. And what I've found through this is basically that people made it worse than the algorithm, if that makes sense. So those who are very interested in diversity, they are usually higher educated, they have more interest, etc., etc. They build a very diverse news environment. They are very interested in all the things. Those who are not build a very non-diverse environment. And what happens is the gaps start opening between these groups. So if we're just saying the solution against the evil algorithms is that we give users more choice, this is what often happens, that we actually see these gaps opening. That was sort of meant to really have an experimental environment where we can test out these things little bit more specific. Yeah, and then I had a little bit of time, so I just made those. This is just to say, sort of, this dissertation was finished in, I think, 2023, late 2022, it was finished before generative AI even entered the picture. And there is potential that this might affect the whole environment much more, because there's all of a sudden a weird centralization going on, so you just have this one agent, this one filter that you're going through. So there's not a lot of filters anymore, but there might just be one, and that's ChatGPT you're talking about. And there is this need to sort of summarize and condense information. Might that be that certain viewpoints or certain nuances actually get lost in the summary? Who decides what gets into the summary? And yeah, there's also this idea of Gen AI agreeing with you because that's what we like. That's what keeps us on the platform. So I think there's quite a lot of potential of doing dissertation 2.0, just taking this into account. But for now, I only have some conclusion points, so it's complicated. User choices play so much more of a role than algorithms, at least at the point that I wrote the thesis. This might be, might become different in the future. We don't know it yet, and there's sort of a growing gap between active and passive users. This sort of comes with the idea of media literacy. Problem is usually the people who take the media literacy offer are also those who are already more interested. So sort of figuring out ways on how to make this very easy and accessible is probably one of the bigger challenge. Data donation, it offers a promising way of doing ethical studies, and the rise of Gen AI adds a very new layer. And now I only have the same slide that I ended my dissertation with because I find it very funny. It's from my favorite comic artist. So I'm pretty sure I convinced you that this is all there's to say about the topic. That's it.
Well, thank you, Felicia, for explaining us about your research, and which you are still continuing at University of Amsterdam. So hopefully there is still a lot to be done for you, and especially now with Gen AI getting into the picture, I think we're not done yet researching this specific topic. So good luck to you and all of your colleagues to help us see the light in the tunnel of our news consumption. Yeah, then I want to take you to our next prize, which is the KHMW Thesis Prize for Humanities. And I'll switch to English now, because this prize this year is for a thesis in the economics and business sciences. And there were 13 nominations. And the jury consisted of Professor Dr. Sjoerd Beugelsdijk, Professor of International Business at University of Groningen, Professor Dr. Beatrice van der Heijden, Professor of Strategic Human Resource Management at the Radboud University, Professor Dr. Kees Koedijk, Professor of Finance at Utrecht University, and Professor Dr. Janka Stoker, Professor of Leadership and Organizational Change at Groningen University. And the prize winner is Rafael Escamilla Gonzalez Aragon. He is currently assistant professor at the Carey School of Business in Arizona State in the US. But we're very happy that he has been able to come to Haarlem today, also combining it with Congress visits in Europe. And so great to have you here in person, Rafael. And I would like to invite Sjoerd Beugelsdijk, the member of the jury, to present the laudatio on behalf of the jury. And after that, Rafael will do the next of the process. So, Sjoerd, may I ask you to come to the stage? Yeah.
Thank you. Rafael, The evaluation committee had the absolute pleasure to read the best dissertations in the discipline of economics and business, defended between January 2021 and December 2024, so it's a 4-year period. The committee was just mentioned, but I'll want to mention them again because I want to thank them explicitly. Kees Koedijk from Utrecht University, Beatrice van der Heijden, Radboud Universiteit Nijmegen, and Janka Stoker, Universiteit Groningen. Myself, my name is Sjoerd Beugelsdijk. I'm at the University of South Carolina. It's interesting to see that someone from Arizona and someone from South Carolina are actually meeting in Haarlem. And the story doesn't stop there. I did my PhD years ago at Tilburg University, where Rafael also got his PhD. So it's a very small world. It was a privilege to read these dissertations, including yours, for a couple of reasons. Yours stand out, and I will explain why. But for an evaluation committee, the nice thing is you get to read the best dissertations that were published or defended in a 4-year period in the discipline where you feel home. Second, it gives a really great overview of the diversity of topics that PhD students in economics and business in the Netherlands are working on. And it's really, and that's the third reason, inspiring to see how frontiers of science are being pushed by these younger scholars, younger than I am. Often explicitly combining the latest scientific insights and methods. And something that stood out across the board was that all, if not many, if not all, of the PhD theses that we read had a clear drive to make a contribution. So the societal contribution element was evident. Nevertheless, we have decided to award the prize to you, Rafael. And then the question is, why? Well, he defended his thesis titled Managing the Nano-Store Supply Chain, Base of the Pyramid Retail and Emerging Markets. So the keyword here is nano-store, and Rafael is going to explain more about that in a minute. In the auditorium of Tilburg University, and what I wrote down was September 12th. Is that a day that you still remember? Yes, okay. Well, you succeeded, September 12, 2023. It was supervised by Jan Franso. I saw Jan in the, yeah, it's over there. Professor Dr. Priska Brosi of Kühne Logistics University in Hamburg. Rafael is currently employed as an assistant professor at Arizona State. But let me say something about why his thesis stand out. First, and perhaps most important, his work is based on the highest scientific standards. In this case, supply chain management. He uses a variety of research methods, including randomized behavioral experiments, survey data analysis, vignette experiments, and overall, the thesis contributes and advances a literature that is sometimes referred to as behavioral operations management. Second, his work matters. Now that sounds so obvious, but it's actually not. He focuses on what is called nano stores. And these are very small and independently owned retail micro businesses. Nano stores are often catering to the immediate neighborhood. When we think of retail, we often think big business. And the reality is, and that's something I learned from Rafael's thesis, is that nano stores form the world's largest retail channel. And he unpacks the supply chain of these nano stores. He looks at sales and distribution channels, financial flows, including informal credit systems, and the use of digital systems and how to use that in a setting that has some informal economy aspects to it. And third, and that was the kicker for the evaluation committee, the thesis breathes nano stores. He really knows what he's talking about. He deeply understands the inner workings of the phenomenon of nano stores, and it reads, it's very well written, it reads as if he's been running a nano store himself for a couple of years. So Rafael, congratulations on behalf of the entire committee. Thank you for the contribution to economics and business research, and I think we all look forward to what you have to say about the thesis.
Rafael, please come forward. And Wim, our Secretary of Humanities as well. Yeah, so congratulations. Well, we have your award. and the letter that comes with it. And then, of course, Wim, wil jij die misschien? Yeah. This is the silver medal that has been handed out for prizes since 1752 here in Haarlem by the Royal Society. So one for you as well, and some flowers. And then it's the moment for a picture. Yeah. And then we hand the floor to you. Yeah, you can perhaps put it down. Yeah, we'll put it down here for you. Yeah. And so, Rafael, over to you.
I'm going to bring the microphones down so everybody can see me. Yeah, it's a great honor to receive this award. I'm very grateful. I actually asked my supervisor and a friend of mine to explain to me how I should say that I'm very thankful in Dutch. So, but I don't know if I should still do that. But ja, ik ben dankbaar en vereerd voor deze prijs. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much. Yeah, it really is a huge honor, and I'm very grateful to my supervisors, Professor Jan Franso and Professor Prisca Brosi, as well as my family, and specifically I want to thank my wife, who was a huge source of support throughout this journey. I will take this opportunity to talk a little bit about nanostores. So nanostores are small, independent, and informal retail microbusinesses like the one you see here in the picture. And just to make sure, I actually did never run a nanostore myself, but I did spend quite a bit of time in the field studying these operations, and I'm very grateful to Jan, who actually started a research line in nanostores, and Edgar Blanco, who was a co-author that worked with Jan in a book introducing this setting that I actually got to experience as a consumer when I was growing up. And specifically what I want to thank them for is the fact that they pushed me to go to the field and interact with these operations, observe how companies sell and distribute their products to these stores, because I think that allowed me to really grasp an understanding of the empirical context. So these nanostores are deeply embedded in bottom-of-the-pyramid communities. And two key characteristics that we wanted to understand in this dissertation were one, on the one side, the fact that many of these shopkeepers have very limited liquidity, so very often they struggle to stock their inventory. And a second aspect is they have very limited digital technologies. So in many cases, they don't even have a basic point-of-sale system, so it's a very informal retail market. So this has resulted in very expensive supply chain operations, and these nanostores are typically supplied by multinational consumer packaged goods manufacturers, so companies like Coca-Cola or Unilever that sell their products into this channel. And for these manufacturers, this is a highly strategic channel because, again, these nanostores are located at the bottom of the pyramid. And for these types of products, that's where a lot of growth is expected to come in the following decades. As disposable incomes grow in these bottom of the pyramid communities, some of those funds will be spent in this nanostore channel. So when I started working on this dissertation together with my advisors, one thing that we noticed was that the supply chain operations serving these nanostores were undergoing a very substantial transformation. So there were a lot of new digital technologies that were starting to emerge in different countries. There were new financial solutions, so a lot of innovation in providing short-term trade credits to support the purchase of inventory by these shopkeepers, and new operational schemes. So there are a lot of new developments taking place in this space, and we were really fascinated by all these different changes. So we zoomed in on a few of these initiatives to understand essentially how the three supply chain flows operate in this setting and how they're being transformed as a result of these innovative schemes. So in particular, we looked at information technologies, we looked at new financial solutions, and new operational schemes. And I'm going to briefly introduce what we did in each of the different chapters. So the dissertation is formed by 4 different chapters for research projects. And essentially in these different projects, so I'm going to start with the second chapter. In this chapter, we wanted to understand what was the impact of short-term trade credits provided by the supplier to these shopkeepers. So essentially, as I mentioned, many of these shopkeepers struggle to acquire their inventory. And so one thing that suppliers could do is to enable these shopkeepers to delay the payment of the orders by a short period of time, right? So they could, for example, skip one cycle and essentially collect payment for their orders 1 week later than they usually do. So typically these stores are visited once or twice per week. And so traditionally they're asked to finance the inventory up front. So essentially whatever they order, they have to pay before they get the products delivered. So we worked with a company that essentially just allowed them to delay their order payment so that they would get the products, be able to sell them throughout the period between visits, and then pay for those products. Nevertheless, I mean, when we interacted with a lot of companies and tried to understand why they weren't doing this as part of their operations, many of them pointed out that this is potentially risky because these are informal stores, and so they could disappear at some point, and you know, then the suppliers would be unable to collect payment for those orders. And so this has been a reason that has kept them from engaging with these types of schemes in the past. So what we did in the dissertation was to quantify what is the operational benefit of having such a policy in place. So we wanted to understand what is the effect of these short-term trade credits. And for that, we collaborated with a distributor in Lima, Peru, that was supplying these nano stores. And some of the insights that we learned were that these short-term trade credits enable shopkeepers to more consistently acquire inventory to buy more products in every transaction. And we found some evidence that there's also an impact on the rejection of products, because oftentimes what happened was that the products would be brought to the store and shopkeepers would be unable to pay for those products because they didn't have enough funds. We quantify all these operational benefits and basically show under which scenarios it makes sense to offer these trade credits. What we find is that suppliers should be offering credits much more broadly than what they currently are doing, because these operational benefits are very, very substantial. So in the third chapter, we look at the conundrum that shopkeepers face when they're deciding whether to adopt digital technologies. So on the one hand, digital technologies might create some efficiencies or potentially also expand the consumer base that these nano stores are serving, maybe by providing additional services, for example. But on the other hand, shopkeepers perceive that there may be some risks associated with adopting technology. So in many cases, these shopkeepers do not pay their full share of taxes. And today they mostly manage their store through pencil and paper records. So this has created a hefty barrier for digitization. So what we wanted to understand what are the drivers and the barriers of technology adoption in this setting. So for that, we conducted a set of vignette experiments in the field and surveys in the field with hundreds of shopkeepers in 3 different cities in Latin America. And what we found is that shopkeepers actually do perceive the benefits of digitizing, but on the other hand, they do recognize that there are some risks, and particularly associated with the transparency of taxes to the tax authorities that prevent them from adopting digital technologies. We found as well that word of mouth can be a key source to tackle this problem and promote digitization in these bottom of the pyramid communities. So in the fourth chapter of the dissertation, we examine how new digital technologies, particularly to offer value-added digital services to to consumers at the bottom of the pyramid, can benefit these nano stores, and specifically, these value-added digital services have been widely deployed by convenience stores, which are organized retailers that are also very common in emerging markets and have been growing very rapidly in recent years. So we looked at an initiative by a nano store supplier, a manufacturer in this case, that was offering these value-added digital services through the nano store channel in an effort to strengthen these nano stores in their competition with these organized retailers. So we have very detailed granular data at the level of each individual nano store, as well as their competitors. And again, because these are nano stores that are deeply embedded in this bottom of the pyramid communities, often with multiple nano stores within a single city block, the competition is really granular. So we wanted to understand, whether this initiative by the manufacturer produced some benefits to those nano stores that were adopting this system, and we wanted to understand that competition, micro competition that was taking place in the field, both with the nano stores around that one which was adopting, but also with the convenience stores that were in the vicinity as well. So what we found is that adopting nano stores experience a substantial uplift in sales that is organic. So we did not capture any evidence of cannibalization with neighboring nano stores or neighboring convenience stores. So essentially, this initiative is helping this manufacturer to grow the pie in this nano store setting and kind of balance the scale a little bit in the competition with these organized retailers. Finally, in the fifth chapter of the dissertation, we look at a strategic decision that suppliers have to make, which is how often to visit each individual nano store. So currently, the equilibrium in this setting is to visit nano stores with a high frequency. So for example, 2 times per week. So we collaborated with a company that gave us some data where we were able to isolate instances where the company adjusted the frequency with which they visit these nano stores. So for example, going from 2 visits every week to 1 visit every week. So we leveraged those shocks in order to capture what is the effect of that additional visit, of that visit frequency. So we wanted to understand how that visit frequency impacts the ordering behavior of shopkeepers. And then we combined this empirical analysis with behavioral experiments to tease the underlying mechanism apart. So what we found is that a reduction in the visit frequency by the suppliers has a strong impact in the order volume per unit of time of these shopkeepers, which essentially creates an incentive for these suppliers to visit with a high frequency. And we tease this effect apart and find that essentially these shopkeepers are over-diversifying their budget. So when they have very limited budget, they're systematically retaining some of their budget, and they're consistently buying products from multiple suppliers, even when under certain circumstances it would be profitable for them to just focus on the more profitable suppliers to maximize their profit. So together, these different chapters in the dissertation provide actionable insights to stakeholders of nanostore supply chains. And these were some of the main takeaways that we have from the dissertation overall. So the first takeaway was that private markets can have really a huge impact in tackling some of the big challenges that bottom of the pyramid communities are experiencing. So problems like access to digital technologies or access to credit. Second one, we found that supply chain flows are very heavily interconnected in these nanostore supply chains, so that, for example, having an initiative that impacts the financial flows in the supply chain will have a very important impact on the product flows in the supply chain, and a similar effect takes place with information flows within the supply chain. And then finally, we found that suppliers actually realize huge benefits in deploying these solutions with their nanostore base. And so they should be very strategic in allocating some of the benefits that are generated by the implementation of these solutions, so as to also share some of those gains with the shopkeepers. So with that, I wrap up my presentation, and I want to once again express my gratitude for this award and my gratitude to my supervisors. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rafael, for this great explanation of your work. Don't think there'll be any nano stores in Arizona, but hopefully you can still continue your research also in that area. Thank you. Then I hope you don't mind if we switch back to Dutch voor de volgende prijs, de KHMW Proefschriftprijs Interdisciplinariteit. Die is ingesteld in 2023, dat is een recente prijs. En u zult begrijpen, dat is ook omdat het interdisciplinaire vakgebied natuurlijk enorm in ontwikkeling is. En we ook dat aandacht wilden geven, omdat dat steeds belangrijker wordt, die multidisciplinariteit voor heel veel verschillende wetenschappelijke gebieden. En deze prijs is mogelijk gemaakt door de Elisabeth Schram-Muller Stichting. En is gericht op bekroning van onderzoek met een bijzonder interdisciplinair karakter, dat de grenzen tussen de klassieke alfa, beta en gamma wetenschapsgebieden overbrugt. En de Dr. Elisabeth Schram-Muller Stichting eert de nagedachtenis aan en beheert de nalatenschap van Elisabeth Schram-Muller, die als uitgever en weldoener onderzoek en onderwijs een zeer warm hart toedroeg. Voor deze prijs zijn, en dat laat ook zien hoe ongelooflijk in ontwikkeling dit interdisciplinaire vakgebied is, want voor deze prijs werden maar liefst 60 proefschriften voorgedragen. En de jury bestond uit professor Dr. ingenieur Sander Baijs, hoogleraar theoretische natuurkunde aan de Universiteit van Amsterdam, professor Dr. Douwe Breimer, emeritus hoogleraar farmacologie en oud-rector magnificus en voorzitter college van bestuur van de Universiteit Leiden. Professor Dr. Aafke Komter, emeritus hoogleraar comparatieve studies of social solidarity aan de Universiteit Utrecht. En professor Dr. ingenieur Rut Mugge, hoogleraar design for sustainable consumer behavior aan de TU Delft en hoogleraar responsible marketing aan de UvA. De prijswinnaar is Dr. Francien Bossema, postdoc aan het Centrum voor Wiskunde en Informatica in Amsterdam. En graag zou ik jurylid Aafke Komter naar voren willen vragen om de laudatio uit te spreken.
Stel, je bent wiskundige en je hebt daarnaast belangstelling voor kunst en cultureel erfgoed. Stel, je vraagt je af hoe oud de kist van Hugo de Groot eigenlijk is. Eigenlijk wil je gewoon weten hoe de houten binnenkant van die kist eruit ziet. Want misschien geeft dat aanwijzingen voor de ouderdom ervan. En als je binnenin een kunstobject kunt kijken, kun je misschien ontdekken hoe het object de tijd heeft doorstaan en of het aan restauratie toe is. Om vragen over de herkomst, ouderdom en huidige staat van kunstobjecten te kunnen beantwoorden, zou je technieken moeten ontwikkelen om CT-scans te maken van kunstobjecten. CT-scans, dat klinkt naar de medische wereld. En dat is wat Francien Bossema heeft gedaan in haar proefschrift Tailoring X-ray Tomography Techniques for Cultural Heritage Research. Met haar gecombineerde achtergrond in wiskunde en wetenschapscommunicatie is Francien Bossema bij uitstek in staat om bruggen te slaan tussen wiskunde/informatica enerzijds en kunstgeschiedenis/conservatie anderzijds. Succesvolle samenwerking met nationale en internationale museumcollega's en het Centrum voor Wiskunde en Informatica leidde al eerder tot de beloning in 2021 met een NWO Team Science Award voor het project over het dateren van de al eerder genoemde boekenkist van Hugo de Groot. De jury voor de KHMW Proefschriftprijs Interdisciplinariteit, die bestond uit Sander Buijs, het is al gezegd, Douwe Breimer, professor Rut Mugge en mijzelf, besloot unaniem om daar nog een beloning aan toe te voegen door Francien Bossema deze prijs toe te kennen. Het gebruik van CT-scans, dus computer tomography, is vooral bekend uit de medische wereld, ik zei het al. Het CT-scannen van kunstobjecten stelt echter aparte eisen, omdat materialen, vormen en maten van kunstobjecten nogal verschillend zijn. Daarnaast is er natuurlijk een logistiek probleem. CT-faciliteiten zijn niet gemakkelijk toegankelijk voor het scannen van kunstobjecten. Zo moeten er waardevolle objecten naar de CT-scanner worden getransporteerd. Verder brengen het transport en de scans doorgaans kosten met zich mee. En dan is er ook nog de uitdaging voor de objectdeskundige om tweedimensionale doorsnedes van driedimensionale objecten te interpreteren. Zij zijn immers getraind om objecten met het blote oog te bestuderen. In haar proefschrift draagt Francien Bossema oplossingen aan voor deze uitdagingen door in samenwerking met de objectdeskundigen algoritmes en software te ontwikkelen en de voorgestelde methode toe te passen op kunstobjecten uit museumcollecties. Het proefschrift is naar het oordeel van de jury om 3 redenen een voortreffelijke kandidaat voor de toekenning van de KHMW-prijs. Allereerst, het laat zien hoe het slaan van bruggen tussen uiteenlopende vakgebieden en interdisciplinaire samenwerking kunnen leiden tot vernieuwende technieken om de interne structuren en daarmee de leeftijd en de staat van kunstobjecten te bestuderen. Ten tweede, deze kennis is buitengewoon relevant voor objectdeskundigen van musea, omdat zij ermee kunnen bepalen of en hoe kunstobjecten gerestaureerd kunnen worden. Ten derde, de buitenkant van kunstwerken bekijken is vaak al heel bevredigend en spannend. Maar met behulp van scantechnieken een kijkje krijgen in de binnenwereld van museumschatten spreekt ook zeer tot de verbeelding. Denk nogmaals aan die Hugo de Grootkist. Door middel van presentaties bij conferenties en symposia weet Francien Bossema haar werk succesvol onder de aandacht te brengen van een breder dan een louter wetenschappelijk publiek. De jury wil Francien Bossema en uiteraard ook haar begeleiders professor Joost Batenburg en professor Veerle Knudde en Dr. Robert van Lang van harte feliciteren met dit prachtige resultaat.
En Ad en Wim, ja. Is Kees inmiddels gearriveerd? Nee, volgens mij niet. Oh. Dan even, we zullen het even aan deze kant doen voor de foto, denk ik. Hè? Jullie willen ons hier hebben? Ja. Even, schuif het even allemaal op. Ja. Ja. Dan mag jij naast hier jouw plaats. Ja. En de pen. Even openmaken. Zo. Ja, en dan even. Ja. Oh, Keesje is er wel. Sorry, ja, ik kan het niet zien. Nee, ja. Super. Ja. Nou, dan geven we graag het woord aan Francien om ons van harte gefeliciteerd. En om ons nog even mee te nemen door haar proefschrift. Ja, dan krijg je dit straks weer terug. Ja.
Even kijken hoor, waar is de handheld microfoon gebleven?
Ja. Ja.
Ja, alsjeblieft. Ik vind het altijd... Staat hij aan? Ja, hij staat aan. Super. Altijd iets prettiger om iets dichter bij het publiek te kunnen staan. Hartelijk dank voor deze eigenlijk al perfecte samenvatting van mijn proefschrift. Ik ga daar toch nog wat plaatjes vooral aan toevoegen. Hier ziet u al een mooi plaatje, daar kom ik zo meteen op terug. Aan de linkerkant ziet u een beeldje, aan de rechterkant de röntgenfoto's van dat beeldje. Ik ben in 2018 begonnen bij het Centrum Wiskunde en Informatica onder begeleiding van Joost Batenburg en Erma Hermans, die toen professor was bij het Rijksmuseum. En het hele project is uitgevoerd onder de vlag van het NICAS, het Netherlands Institute for Conservation, Art and Science. En daar kwam natuurlijk COVID tussendoor, dus ik heb er iets langer over gedaan. En toen ben ik uiteindelijk vorig jaar, 23 mei 2024, gepromoveerd op dit onderwerp. Het onderzoek heeft uiteindelijk geresulteerd, omdat ik eigenlijk meer ook in de beta zit, in 4 eerste auteursartikelen en nog een stuk of 6 tweede auteursartikelen, gepubliceerde artikelen, die dan geschreven werden door mijn Rijksmuseum-collega's, wat ook heel erg mooi aangeeft hoe interdisciplinair het eigenlijk is. Want vaak schreef ik dan een technisch paper en schreven zij vervolgens nog een paper over het object zelf en wat we daarover geleerd hadden. En ik heb echt op super toffe plekken mogen werken. Het Centrum Wiskunde en Informatica, wat er prima uitziet als die mooie boom in bloei staat. En daarnaast natuurlijk het Rijksmuseum, wat heel erg bijzondere plek is om te werken. En daarnaast heb ik ook nog de kans gekregen om bij het British Museum in Londen 6 maanden een soort zijproject te doen. En het Getty Museum in Los Angeles heb ik in eerste instantie alleen digitaal mee samengewerkt. Maar toen mijn promotie was afgerond, hebben zij mij nog uitgenodigd voor een summer internship. Dus zeg maar nog 3 maanden als summer scholar daar te gast te zijn vorig jaar. Dus dat was heel erg leuk. Wat is computertomografie? Het werd al even genoemd, CT. U bent er waarschijnlijk allemaal een beetje bekend mee uit de medische wereld. Het werkt met röntgenstralen. Als je bijvoorbeeld een bot gebroken hebt, maakt men vaak een röntgenfoto. En daarop kun je dan dat bot goed zien, want dat heeft een hogere dichtheid dan het vlees en de spieren die daar omheen zitten. En CT is eigenlijk de 3-dimensionale versie daarvan. Je gebruikt een heleboel röntgenfoto's, gemaakt vanuit verschillende hoeken. Dus wij draaien vaak het object rond, waarbij we allemaal foto's nemen van alle kanten van het object. En vervolgens gebruik je dus zo'n 1800 röntgenfoto's om een 3-dimensionaal beeld te krijgen van de binnenkant van je object, wat je vervolgens, zoals je hier aan de rechterkant kunt zien, kunt doorsnijden in verschillende richtingen om echt een op dichtheid gebaseerd beeld te krijgen van de binnenkant van je object. En dit kun je eigenlijk met allerlei dingen doen. Alleen is het ingewikkelder dan bij medische CT-scans, want die zijn uiteraard te standaardiseren. Want wij zijn allemaal toch voornamelijk hetzelfde materiaal, erg veel water. En we verwachten ook ongeveer dezelfde organen op dezelfde plek. Dat is toch bij kunstobjecten heel anders. Je ziet hier een grote diversiteit aan soorten, materialen, vormen en ook heel vaak meerdere materialen. Wat het erg ingewikkeld maakt om bijvoorbeeld de hoogte van je röntgenstraal, de intensiteit daarvan te kiezen. Want hoe hoger de intensiteit, hoe makkelijker het door dichtere materialen heen komt. Het beeldje wat we daarnet al zagen, daar wil ik even kort over vertellen wat we daarmee gedaan hebben, omdat ik dat een mooi voorbeeld vind. Hierbij hebben we gekeken naar dendrochronologie, wat natuurlijk niet mijn expertise is. Ik heb er wel ongelooflijk veel over geleerd in de afgelopen jaren, omdat ik heel veel heb samengewerkt met een collega van het Rijksmuseum. En dat vond ik ook zo leuk aan dit heel erg interdisciplinaire project. Het heeft mij heel erg de kans gegeven om nog heel veel te leren over de kunstkant, want ik kwam vanuit de wiskunde. Dit beeldje hebben wij gescand en je kunt hier zien dat we het in dit geval, omdat het te hoog was voor onze scanner, dit is de scanner bij het Centrum Wiskunde en Informatica, hebben we in 5 scans gedaan. Dus we hebben 5 keer een volledige CT-scan van het beeldje gedaan en die vervolgens aan elkaar vastgeplakt om dit 3D-beeld te krijgen. Dit 3D-beeld kunnen we vervolgens dus in verschillende richtingen doorsnijden. In dit geval wilde de collega van het Rijksmuseum graag het beeldje dwars doormidden hebben eigenlijk. Dat mocht niet, dus vandaar hebben we dat digitaal gedaan. En dan krijg je een doorsnede zoals hier. En waarom is dit van belang? zij moest de jaarringen goed kunnen zien. Want dendrochronologie, dat heb ik nog niet gezegd, maar is het meten van de jaarringen om de leeftijd van het hout te bepalen. En daarvoor heb je zoveel mogelijk jaarringen nodig. En het is dus heel vaak moeilijk om die goed te zien aan de buitenkant. Omdat beelden, in dit geval is die niet meer geschilderd, maar vaak zijn ze ook geschilderd of is de zijkant van het hout, alle jaarringen helemaal niet toegankelijk. En op basis hiervan kon zij niet alleen een jaartal vinden, maar zelfs de locatie waar het hout vandaan komt. Omdat dat zo specifiek is, de jaarringsequentie is zo specifiek dat je dat dus kunt vinden. En wat we hier was de hypothese dat dit beeld uit België kwam, dus ten zuiden van de rivieren. Maar zoals je kan zien op het plaatje, het hout komt uit de oranje cirkel. En dat hout is alleen maar gevonden bij alle andere oranje stippen. Dus alles is boven de rivieren. Dus dat betekent dat we eigenlijk de hypothese dat dit beeld uit België kwam, konden uitsluiten. Nou, dat is het type vragen dat er gesteld wordt door mijn museumcollega's. En vervolgens wil ik nog even kijken naar de uitdagingen. Die zijn eigenlijk al genoemd, dus dat is heel fijn. Verplaatsen is lastig. Dit is de CT-scanner bij het CWI zelf. Maar dan moeten we dus de objecten laten verplaatsen om die te kunnen scannen op hoge resolutie. Dit is niet altijd mogelijk met kunstobjecten die natuurlijk ook hoge waarden kunnen hebben. En vervolgens hebben we dus de problemen van dat ze zo divers zijn. De Hugo de Grootkist wilden we inderdaad ook heel graag kunnen scannen. Want hij zat aan de buitenkant, zat er leer overheen en er zaten ijzeren banden omheen, waardoor het heel ingewikkeld was voor mijn collega om naar die jaarringen te kijken. En het idee was dat er 3 verschillende kisten waren die mogelijk de kist waren, waarin hij is ontsnapt in 1621. Ik ga dat verhaal nu maar niet vertellen, want ik neem aan dat de meeste Nederlanders in de zaal het verhaal kennen. Dus hij was een gevangene en hij is in een boekenkist ontsnapt uit de gevangenis. En het idee was, als we kunnen aantonen dat het hout pas gekapt is na die 1621, dan weet je dat het nog een boom was en geen kist. Dus dan kon hij daar niet in ontsnapt zijn. Hij was alleen veel te groot voor de scanner bij het CWI, dus hebben we hem in het Rijksmuseum in de scanner gezet. En ook daar was hij eigenlijk te groot om een volledige CT-scan te kunnen doen. Dus hiervoor hebben we een nieuwe techniek ontwikkeld, waarbij we hem alleen van links naar rechts hebben verplaatst, in plaats van die volledige rotatie, waardoor we toch een scherp beeld konden krijgen van de jaarringen, wat eigenlijk het doel was van dit project, dat we de jaarringen goed in beeld kregen. Dus dit was een mooie combinatie van nieuwe techniek ontwikkelen op basis van de vraag vanuit het museum. En het werd al genoemd, maar hier heb ik dus samen met mijn collega hier op de foto Jan Dorscheid en Marta Dominguez del Mas de Team Science Award voor gewonnen in 2021. Wat een hele leuke bevestiging was van onze samenwerking. Mijn belangrijkste project eigenlijk vanuit het algoritmekant gezien is dit project, wat in samenwerking is gegaan uiteindelijk met het Getty Museum in Los Angeles en het British Museum in Londen. En zoals je kunt zien hebben die alle 3 een vrij vergelijkbare opstelling om röntgenfoto's te maken. Maar wat ik al zei, een röntgenfoto, we hebben er een stuk of 1800 nodig om een goede CT-scan te kunnen maken. En dat kunnen ze vaak niet. Dus vaak zijn dit soort opstellingen echt alleen bedoeld voor losse röntgenfoto's. Maar wij dachten, we hebben wel alle ingrediënten. We hebben zo'n röntgenbron, we hebben een draaitafel, we hebben een röntgendetector. Daar moeten we iets op kunnen verzinnen, dat we dit kunnen gebruiken om toch CT-scans te maken. Heel kort, wat heb je nodig voor een CT-scan? De röntgenfoto's en de parameters. En wat ik bedoel met parameters zijn, we moeten weten hoe ver stond die röntgenbron af van het object, hoeveel graden is hij gedraaid tussen verschillende röntgenfoto's, waar stond die detector. Dat moeten we allemaal heel precies weten, tot op de micrometer precies. En dat noemen we een calibration. Als je die calibration niet hebt, kun je ook geen goede reconstructie maken, want dan kun je die 1800 verschillende röntgenfoto's niet goed aan elkaar linken om een mooi 3D-beeld te maken. Dus wat was het idee? We voegen wat metalen balletjes toe aan de scan. Dus in dit geval gaat het om dit leuke houten blokje wat ik hier heb meegenomen. Daar hebben we wat foam omheen gezet met een paar metalen balletjes. En die metalen balletjes die zie je dan dus helemaal rechts, ook op de röntgenfoto als dikke zwarte stippen. Vervolgens hebben we de locatie van die zwarte stippen gebruikt om al die parameters terug te rekenen. Dus uiteindelijk konden we alle parameters bepalen op basis van deze zwarte stippen op de röntgenfoto. En hier zie je dat we dit gedaan hebben. Dus dit blokje heeft een prachtige reis afgelegd van Amsterdam naar Los Angeles en naar Londen. Hebben we dit dus gescand op bij alle drie de musea en natuurlijk ook bij het CWI. Waarbij we een goede 3D-reconstructie konden maken. En hier zie je de doorsnedes van het houten blokje en dus ook de jaringen weer terug. Op alle vier de locaties. En het mooie is dat we hier kunnen laten zien dat we zien dezelfde jaringen, we zien dezelfde binnenkant van dat houten blokje. Ondanks dat de ene scherper is dan de andere en dat hangt af van de detector bijvoorbeeld, dus van de hardware die ze hebben staan. Maar we konden wel laten zien dat het dus mogelijk is om op basis van alleen maar het toevoegen van wat metalen balletjes een CT-scan te maken. Die balletjes hadden we trouwens gewoon bij de fietsenmaker gekocht, want die zitten ook in je pedaal. Wat een mooi voorbeeld is dat we dit natuurlijk ook hebben geprobeerd op een echt object. Dit is een python die een gnu doodt van het Getty Museum. En het mooie, wat ik ook wel erg mooi vind, is dat dit dus allemaal alleen maar digitaal is. Dus ik heb alleen maar met hen gezoomd en via mail verteld wat ze moesten doen. En dan zat ik mee te kijken wat zij zaten te doen in de röntgenkamer. En hier kun je zien dat op een röntgenfoto al wel te zien is dat er van alles gaande is aan de binnenkant van dit object. En dat komt omdat de maker heeft hem op een gegeven moment veranderd. Dus het is een gipsen beeld en hij heeft op een gegeven moment stukken afgebroken om te kijken om er een andere vorm van te maken. En met de behulp van de CT-scan konden mijn collega's dat dus heel goed zien. Ik zal alleen de nek even aanwijzen. In het blauwe stukje kan je heel goed zien dat er iets tussen is gezet. Dus de nek is gebroken en het hoofd is iets verder van het lichaam afgehaald om er een langer object van te maken. Nou, zo hebben zij nog een tiental andere kleine dingen over dit object geleerd op basis van die CT-scan. Ter conclusie, je kunt dus een hele grote hoeveelheid verschillende informatie uit CT-scans halen over kunstobjecten. En dat is dus een heel veelbelovend vakgebied wat nog best wel in de kinderschoenen staat. En door de grote variëteit in die kunstobjecten kun je eigenlijk geen standaard scans doen. En door onze samenwerking en softwareontwikkeling is die techniek nu toegankelijker. En dat was heel tof, want we hebben dit laatste project ook kunnen publiceren in Nature Communications, wat een van de grote vakbladen is in interdisciplinair onderzoek. Dus dat was ook heel tof. Dus tot slot wil ik nog een kort dankwoord richten. Ten eerste aan de KHMW voor het uitreiken van deze prijs en het instellen van deze prijs sinds dus nu een aantal jaar voor interdisciplinair onderzoek. Ik vind het erg fijn dat jullie het belang van interdisciplinair onderzoek hiermee erkennen en ook onderzoekers hiermee belonen. En ik ben vereerd dat mijn werk dit jaar is uitgekozen uit zoveel fantastisch 60 inzendingen, die interdisciplinair onderzoek. De nominatoren Joost Batenburg, Veerle Knudde en Robert van Lang. En natuurlijk ook mijn promotoren Joost Batenburg en Erma Hermens. Dan te veel om op te noemen, collega's, co-auteurs en iedereen waarmee ik heb samengewerkt en die mij hebben geïnspireerd. En tot slot wil ik graag mijn familie en vrienden bedanken die mij gesteund en toegejuicht hebben. En in het bijzonder die hier vandaag aanwezig zijn. Mijn ouders, mijn schoonouders, Jack en Marie en mijn man Frank. Bedankt voor jullie steun en jullie aanwezigheid vandaag om dit feestelijke moment met mij te vieren. Tot slot mijn felicitaties aan de andere prijswinnaars van vandaag. Laten we er een mooi feest van maken met elkaar.
Nou, dankjewel Francien voor dit interessante letterlijke doorkijkje in een aantal hele mooie kunstobjecten. Dat er nog vele mogen volgen en dat ook verschillende disciplines weer verder kan brengen in het onderzoek, mede dankzij deze techniek. Heel mooi, een ware prijswinnaar voor een interdisciplinariteitsprijs. Dan wil ik graag overgaan naar de laatste prijsuitreiking van vanmiddag. En dat is de KHMW van der A. Oeuvreprijs. Die prijs is bedoeld als een eerbetoon aan een wetenschapper die zich verdienstelijk heeft gemaakt op het gebied van de geestes- en maatschappijwetenschappen. Reglementair is de prijs ieder jaar voor een ander vakgebied bestemd en dat gaat in een cyclus van 8 vakgebieden. En dit jaar is hij voor wijsbegeerte en religiewetenschappen, inclusief godgeleerdheid. De prijs wordt dit jaar voor de 2e keer toegekend. En hij is vernoemd naar het eerste lid van de maatschappij, die tevens van 1752 tot 1793 de eerste secretaris was, Christiaan van der A. Hij speelde een prominente rol in de vormgeving van de Hollandse maatschappij. En hij was geesteswetenschapper en Luthers predikant. En was als secretaris van de economische tak van de maatschappij ook actief voor de maatschappijwetenschappen. Dus mooi om ook Christiaan van der A op deze manier in de vorm van een prijs te blijven gedenken. De jury voor deze prijs bestond uit professor Dr. James McAllister, hoogleraar wetenschapsfilosofie aan de Universiteit van Leiden, professor Dr. Herman Beck, emeritus hoogleraar godsdienstwetenschap, in het bijzonder van de islam aan Tilburg University, professor Dr. Martin van Hees, hoogleraar ethiek en politieke filosofie aan de Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam en lid van het bestuur, CQ-voorzitter, domein Geesteswetenschappen, KHMW. En professor Dr. Helene Murre van den Berg, hoogleraar mondiaal christendom, decaan faculteit filosofie, theologie en religiewetenschappen van de Radboud Universiteit. De prijs is toegekend aan professor Dr. Wouter Hanegraaff, hoogleraar geschiedenis van de hermetische filosofie en verwante stromingen van de UvA. En heel graag zou ik jurylid James McAllister willen uitnodigen om de laudatio uit te spreken namens de jury.
Het is mij een grote eer en een oprecht genoegen om vandaag een laudatio uit te spreken voor een uitzonderlijk geleerde, een scherpzinnig denker en een pionier op zijn vakgebied, professor Dr. Wouter Hanegraaff. Gedurende de voorbije 3 decennia heeft professor Hanegraaff zich met toewijding en visie ingezet voor de studie van de westerse esoterie, een onderzoeksgebied dat lange tijd werd weggeschreven als marginaal of irrelevant, maar dankzij zijn eruditie, intellectuele integriteit en diplomatieke gaven is uitgegroeid tot een volwaardige en internationaal erkende tak van de geesteswetenschappen. Als hoogleraar geschiedenis van de hermetische filosofie en verwante stromingen aan de Universiteit van Amsterdam heeft hij niet alleen een nieuw academisch veld helpen vestigen, maar ook generatiestudenten gevormd in cultuurhistorische kennis en methodologische zelfreflectie. De manier waarop in het Westen naar esoterische tradities werd gekeken, werd lange tijd bepaald door het idee van onttovering, zoals geformuleerd door Max Weber. Moderne, geseculariseerde samenlevingen zouden het magische en mysterieuze achter zich hebben gelaten. Enkele denkers hebben dat dominante beeld met kracht ter discussie gesteld. Francis Yates toonde aan dat het hermetisme van doorslaggevend belang was voor het wereldbeeld van de Renaissance. Antoine Faivre gaf de studie van het westerse esoterisme een eigen definitie en onderzoeksprogramma. In dit gezelschap behoort zonder twijfel ook professor Hanegraaff. Het werk van professor Hanegraaff benadert het esoterisme niet als een randverschijnsel, maar als een onmisbaar onderdeel van de intellectuele geschiedenis van het Westen. Tegelijkertijd onderzoekt hij de historiografische verdringing van esoterische kennis. In werken als Esotericism and the Academy van 2012 laat hij zien hoe de esoterische door het rationalisme van de verlichting en de academische instituties die daarop volgden systematisch uit de kanon werd geweerd. Die kritische reconstructie verbindt historische analyse met filosofisch inzicht en opent nieuwe perspectieven op wat kennis is en wie bepaalt wat als legitiem geldt. Zijn oeuvre als geheel, waaronder ook New Age Religion and Western Culture van 1996, Hermetic Spirituality and the Historical Imagination van 2022 en het recent verschenen Esotericism in Western Culture, getuigt van een indrukwekkende intellectuele reikwijdte en een zeldzaam fijnzinnige hermeneutiek. Steeds weer laat hij zien dat het juist de zogenoemd marginale stromingen zijn die ons helpen het dominante denken beter te doorgronden en ons erfgoed in al zijn complexiteit en tegenstrijdigheid te begrijpen. Daarnaast is zijn institutionele bijdrage van blijvende waarde. Als medeoprichter en voormalig president van de European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism gaf professor Hanegraaff mee vorm aan een internationale infrastructuur die grensoverschrijdend onderzoek en academische uitwisseling mogelijk maakt. Zijn gezag reikt dan ook ver voorbij Nederland. Wereldwijd geldt hij als een sleutelfiguur in de studie van het esoterische denken. Wat professor Hanegraaff echter werkelijk uitzonderlijk maakt, zijn niet alleen de reikwijdte en invloed van zijn werk, maar is zijn intellectuele houding. Zijn openheid voor het ongehoorde, zijn afkeer van dogmatisme, zijn vermogen tot kritische distantie, zonder ooit in cynisme te vervallen. Hij verrijkt de kanon, niet door deze te ondermijnen, maar door deze te verdiepen. Hij is in de meest klassieke zin van het woord een humanist. Het is dan ook ten volle verdiend dat professor Hanegraaff vandaag wordt bekroond met de van de Oeuvreprijs. Deze onderscheiding erkent niet alleen zijn baanbrekende bijdragen aan de studie van esoterie, maar ook zijn bredere betekenis voor de wijsbegeerte en de religiewetenschappen. Zijn werk toont dan dat ware wetenschap voortkomt uit een zoeken naar betekenis, inzicht en wijsheid. Namens de jury van de KHMW van de Oeuvreprijs 2025, bestaande uit professor Herman Beck, Tilburg University, professor Maarten van Hees, Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, professor Helene Muur van den Berg, Radboud Universiteit en mij, bied ik professor Hanegraaff mijn hartelijke felicitaties aan.
Bijblijven voor de prijsuitreiking. Nou, Wouter. Ja. Ja, een bloemetje. Ja. En ja, de oorkonde. Ja. Ja, we gaan even voor de foto. Oh, en dat is de brief waar alles in staat. En dan hebben we ook voor jou hier de... Nee, ik zal deze vasthouden. Wacht even, dit staat een beetje raar, denk ik. Ja. Ja, nou, van harte gefeliciteerd. Ja. Ja. En zal ik het even van je overnemen? Zo. En even de bloemen ook? Ja, dan leg ik die even hier. Ja.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, James McAllister, for the beautiful laudatio. Very much appreciated it. Dear members of the selection committee, dear colleagues, dear friends, to explain what the study of esotericism is all about, I would like to begin by reading to you a passage from a literary novel that has nothing to do with esotericism. The title is Perelman's Schweigen, and it was published in 1995 by the Swiss philosopher and writer Pascal Mercier. This passage describes how children pick up ideas about the world from what they hear their parents say during a vacation trip through Italy. So here we go. Mestre is ugly, says the father, whenever the topic turns to Venice. Venice is a dream. Mestre, on the other hand, is ugly. We hear the sentence over and over again. It comes with the regularity of a machine. It is sheer repetition, the click of an automatism, nothing else. And then you repeat the sentence. You have not checked it. There's not any question of having made it your own. All that's really happening is this. You repeat it. You say it again with increasing routine. That's all. You understand the sentence. It's a sentence in your mother tongue. Nonetheless, it does not express anything that one could call a thought. It is a blindly understood sentence, literally thoughtless. The Po Valley is boring is another of these sentences, this time from the mother. From now on, you say, if it's night when you're traveling through the Po Valley, that doesn't matter. The Po Valley is boring anyway, and so on. The sentence is no longer up for discussion. It's a fixed point inside, a given, a basic load bearer in the construction. It flips a railroad switch forever. It sends one track out of service, obstructs a possibility. It steals a landscape from you, a piece of earth, because it directs you around this area and thus turns it into a white, blind patch on the map of experiences. How many of our familiar sentences behave like the sentences about Mestre and the Po Valley, without our noticing? Well, against this background, I would like to invite you to consider some other familiar sentences that academics and many non-academics tend to take for granted. Alchemy is pseudoscience. Occult beliefs are not worth taking seriously. All that esoteric stuff is just nonsense. Irrational ideas are not worth our attention. Well, Pascal Marché used this metaphor of a railroad switch that causes the train to move forward along one particular track while making the other track entirely inaccessible. You can no longer take that road. The area to which it could otherwise have led you will now remain unknown, a white, blind patch on the map of experiences. Well, that is what the study of esotericism is all about. In my field, we flip that railroad switch the other way, and we insist on studying a white blind patch on the map of human experiences in the history of European culture and the Greater West. If we do so, we may discover, perhaps to our surprise, that even today it remains probably the single largest terrain of unexplored territory in the modern humanities. Well, our job as academics generally consists, of course, in the search for knowledge, wetenschap. That's what scholarship is all about. Our central concern should be to learn new things, to explore the unknown so as to understand it better. To use a famous Star Trek quote that I like to quote, we should never ever hesitate to boldly go where no one has gone before. But in actual fact, and often without being aware of it, most scholars in the humanities make actually highly selective and often deeply conservative choices. Choices about where they do and where they do not want to go, what they want to explore and what they wish to ignore. Even worse, we usually do not even really make such choices ourselves. We tend to just follow the lead of previous authorities who already made those choices for us. Exactly like the children in Mercier's text, who simply adopt ideas from their parents without asking themselves whether they actually agree with them or not. The result of this is that our maps of learning in the humanities, at least since the 18th century, have been seriously incomplete. They still contain very large areas that are similar to Mestre or the Po Valley. Academics don't go there. They don't feel that they need to know what is happening in those places. And so they never get to see the landscape or meet the inhabitants. It's as though we have been trying in the humanities to complete a jigsaw puzzle of European culture in all its complexity, but we do not quite succeed because we stubbornly insist that part of the pieces should not be used. Why does this happen? It is because we have been told by our educational institutions, and are still being told implicitly or explicitly most of the time, that it would be a waste of our time. Mestre is ugly. The Po Valley is boring. Alchemy is pseudoscience. The occult is not worth taking seriously. All that esoteric stuff is just nonsense. Irrational ideas are not worth our attention, right? Well, you guessed it, no, it's not right. It's not right at all. That's the point. Let's take the case of alchemy. We have been told that alchemy is nothing but pseudoscience, based upon weird dreams of making gold. There's something ridiculous about those self-declared adepts who used to be wasting their lives on pursuing chimeras such as the Philosopher's Stone or the elixir of eternal life. Because of those taken for granted assumptions about what alchemy was all about, historians of science have been deeply puzzled by the fact that no one less than the great Isaac Newton himself was deeply interested in alchemical theory and practice. In 2008, I was present at the 200-year anniversary celebration of this organization's Dutch sister society, the Royal Dutch Academy of Arts and Science, the KHMW, titled The Magic of Science. In front of the crème de la crème of Dutch scientists and scholars, the Queen of the Netherlands sitting in the front row, one of the speakers went out of his way to explain that Isaac Newton must have been clinically crazy for long periods of his life, as demonstrated by his otherwise inexplicable obsession with something as irrational and superstitious as alchemy. I was deeply embarrassed by that talk because it was clear that the speaker, for all his undoubted credentials in his own field, had no idea what he was talking about. The true story is nowadays well known to historians of science, but may still be surprising to many others. In 1936, a large box full of unpublished and previously unknown manuscripts by Sir Isaac Newton, including a great number devoted to alchemy, was auctioned at Sotheby's. A large part was bought by the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, who was amazed by this discovery, and he donated the materials to Trinity College. Amazingly, these manuscripts had been left out of Newton's collected works because his successors had been deeply embarrassed that such a great scientist had been dabbling in the occult. They must have felt that they knew better than Newton himself. He should never have gone to Mestre. He should have avoided the Po Valley. Well, the serious study of Newton's alchemical papers got underway after World War II, but many historians of science actually objected to such research. Their basic attitude may be captured by a dramatic statement from the great pioneer of history of science, George Sarton. In 1924, he wrote in tones of deep alarm, it was really alarm, about what is recognized today as a classic masterpiece of the discipline, Lynn Thorndyke's 8-volume A History of Magic and Experimental Science. Experimental science could have nothing to do with magic, Sarton objected, for science was, and I quote, a growing light eating up the darkness, by which he meant, of course, the darkness of magic and occult superstition. Science walks forward, magic walks backward, he wrote, and therefore they could never walk together, historically or in any other way. When another towering historian of science, Richard Westphal, published his classic biography of Newton in 1980, he still felt that he needed to defend himself against the suspicion of occult sympathies by making, quote, a personal declaration that he was not himself an alchemist and was just doing his work as an historian. I have undertaken to write a biography of Newton, he wrote, and my personal preferences cannot make more than 1 million words that he wrote in the study of alchemy disappear. The Enlightenment historian Margaret Jacob, you see her here, has given us a bit of background to these defensive remarks. During the 1970s, when Westphal presented his work on Newton's alchemy at a large international conference in the history of science, there were audible gasps, and under a barrage of hostile questioning, Westphal retorted in exasperation, I did not write those manuscripts, or words to that effect. So, What had Newton been doing there in Mestre? Why had he been exploring the Po Valley in search of alchemical secrets? The explanation is perfectly simple, because he was a scientist. He wanted to find out for himself instead of just relying on biased and second-hand information. Thanks to groundbreaking work by major specialists such as Betty Jo Tito Dobbs, Bruce Moran, Lawrence Principe, William Newman, and many others, this is just a small sample. Today we know that it was perfectly normal and entirely legitimate for early modern scientists to study these things. Moreover, the meticulous laboratory researches of those deluded alchemists had actually led to real scientific discoveries. Newton had not been crazy, he was just doing his job. Well, alchemy is usually lumped together with other discredited disciplines, such as magic and astrology, under the popular umbrella term, the occult sciences. But what I just told you about alchemy is also true for those other fields. As Lynn Thorndike already understood, you cannot understand the actual history of experimental science unless you fully include the history of what is known as magia naturalis, natural magic, and its deep entanglement with alchemy and astrology. If you try to cut out the history of magic and the occult, you end up amputating the history of science. But next to science, not to mention literature and the arts, for which I won't have time today, unfortunately, religion and philosophy are just as central to modern esotericism research, and they are actually interwoven with one another in very complicated ways. This makes esotericism into an inherently interdisciplinary field, not the least of its attractions. By the way, the modern noun esotericism appeared in the 18th century, but it comes from a Greek adjective that has to do with secret teachings. And the word occult comes from Latin and means hidden. Well, traditionally, supreme knowledge about the hidden, occult powers of nature was supposed to have been taught in secret esoterically, by ancient authorities, most famously by a legendary Egyptian sage known as Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest Hermes. This supreme hermetic wisdom was supposed to cover not just the secrets of the natural world, but also the deeper hidden dimensions of religion and philosophy. Here you see Hermes depicted on the wall of the Walburgis Church in Zutphen, here in the Netherlands. So you might wonder what was Hermes doing there on the wall of its church in the Netherlands? Well, to understand this, you have to go back very far into history. After the conversion of the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, and the intellectual legitimacy of such ancient traditions became a highly contentious matter. The problem was very simple. Hermes Trismegistus had been a pagan. How could he be a teacher of superior wisdom if he had come from a country and a culture, Egypt, that was widely seen by Jews and Christians as the very origin of dark magic, idolatry, and superstition? And how was this supposedly superior wisdom related to the philosophy of Plato, yet another pagan, not to mention the Persian Zoroaster, who was even believed to have invented magic? Well, much of my work over the past decades has been driven by a deep fascination with this conflictual encounter between the pagan traditions in late Hellenistic culture and the radical or exclusive monotheisms of Judaism, Christianity, and eventually Islam. Christian intellectuals had been quick to discover that, well, Jesus Christ had not been much of a theologian. You just couldn't create a solid doctrinal system based just on the Gospels or even the letters of the Apostle Paul. You urgently needed help from the superior philosophies of pagan thinkers, such as Plato and his successors, and perhaps even from these remote barbarian ancestors, such as Zoroaster and Hermes Trismegistus. In my book, Esotericism and the Academy, 2012, I've tried to trace the long and complicated history of a perennial love-hate relation between Hellenistic paganism on the one hand and radical Christian monotheism on the other. As in a deeply conflictual marriage between two badly matched partners, I hope you can appreciate the humor of this slide. These two could neither live without one another, nor could they live with one another. These domestic disputes between paganism and monotheism reached fever pitch at the period of the Renaissance, when countless ancient manuscripts became available in Latin translations from Greek and Arabic originals and could be disseminated now at an unprecedented scale due to the recent invention of printing. In the wake of Luther's Reformation just a few decades later, the conflict exploded in a full-scale war of extreme polarization in which the Christian Bible as God's word was pitted against pagan idolatry, as in the Beeldenstorm in our country. There were many attempts at mediation, though, mediation and compromise between monotheism and paganism. And precisely these efforts at building bridges are covered today by the esotericism label. From Marsilio Ficino's Platonic theology, Lodovico Lazzarelli's Hermetic spirituality, to the Christian Kabbalah that was pioneered by Pico della Mirandola and Johannes Reuchlin, and from the Christian theosophical speculations of Paracelsus or Jacob Böhme to the Hermetic Lutheranism of the Rosicrucian manifestos. I'm just mentioning a few names and words here. Well, roughly prior to the 1990s, most of these influential figures and traditions were studied either in isolation by just a few specialists or were not studied at all, because of those patterns of prejudice that I tried to describe. According to mainstream academic perspectives in history of philosophy, science, and religion at that time, all that stuff might as well have been located in Mestre or the Po Valley. The crucial railroad switch by which such traditions were turned into a no-go area for respectable academics had been created by a small group of Protestant and Enlightenment intellectuals during the 17th and the 18th centuries. Their names may no longer be so well known, but their influence was pervasive and decisive, as I have tried to show in my work. The most important of them were Jacob Thomasius and his son Christian, Christoph August Heumann, and Johann Jacob Brucker. These guys were making a double argument. Firstly, all those ancient pagan traditions and their modern defenders were seen as religiously wrong, because they did not rely on the Bible, but on pagan idolatry and demonic magic. Secondly, they were also seen as intellectually wrong, because they were built not on rational argument or scientific evidence, but on irrationality and pseudoscience. It is on this basis that Jacob Brucker wrote his seminal history of philosophy, the massive Historia Critica Philosophiae, an encyclopedic treatise that was plagiarized on an enormous scale by such famous Enlightenment reference works as Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie and many other similar reference works. It was pervasive. The message was clear. All true philosophy and all true religion should be strictly kept apart from pseudo-philosophy and superstition. This latter domain was just a bunch of nonsense below the dignity of serious academics or historical scholars. So it became the Po Valley of research, widely imagined as a discredited ghetto inhabited by backward fools, a seedy place where you just don't want to be spotted by your colleagues. Over the next 2 centuries, this basic narrative of rejected knowledge became deeply embedded as a self-evident assumption passed on as a matter of course by our educational institutions, including our universities. By the sharpest possible contrast, scholars of esotericism began insisting since the 1990s on visiting and spending time in this vast terra incognita of rejected knowledge. We want to see for ourselves. We explore this terrain as historians and scholars by using the same critical and historical methods that are used in studying other and better known fields. And so what do you find when you do this kind of work? Well, there's no doubt that some parts of Mestre are actually ugly, but other parts are surprisingly beautiful, and the diversity is much, much greater than our predecessors assumed. Exploring the Po Valley is not boring at all. In fact, it is fascinating. You can spend a lifetime of fruitful research on all these esoteric traditions, and still you will have barely scratched the surface. Such experiences of discovery have important implications, I think. They teach you a healthy suspicion about the things that we take for granted about reality and truth. As I formulated in my most recent book, they cultivate a counter-normative sensitivity about the hidden normativities that are at work when we draw distinctions between normality and whatever we find weird. We find weird because it challenges our assumptions about what reality is and how it works. So I just try to sketch the broader agenda that has inspired all my work, starting with my dissertation on the New Age movement published in 1996, to my recent textbook about esotericism in Western culture. Yet most of my research has been focused not on theory, but on critical historiography and detailed textual hermeneutic analysis of specific primary sources in a variety of languages. I'm deeply convinced that such bottom-up empirical methods are indispensable to any serious research in the context of the humanities. And I'd like to emphasize that point on this occasion, because frankly, I am afraid that the humanities are currently in the process of losing touch with these foundations of scholarship. Be that as it may, a central component of my own work has always consisted in close textual hermeneutic analysis of the so-called corpus hermeticum and a series of related texts from late antiquity that were attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, him again. These profound and fascinating treatises straddle the boundaries between philosophy and religion, or individual spiritual practice. They became famous during the Renaissance due to this particular Latin translation you see here in 1471 by the Christian Platonist Marsilio Ficino. However, in a book that I published with Ruud Bouthorn 20 years ago, I tried to show that the true hero of Renaissance Hermetism was actually not this famous Ficino, but a forgotten humanist poet, Lodovico Lazzarelli, the pupil of an extremely weird apocalyptic preacher, Giovanni Mercurio da Correggio, who came to think of himself as no one less than the Hermetic Christ, who had returned to Earth to save humanity. His devoted, sensitive, and intellectually talented follower, Lodovico Lazzarelli, produced a literary gem titled Crater Hermetis, or a Vessel of Hermes. It shows that he had absorbed the original Hermetic message much more deeply than the great Ficino, who had translated the texts, but had not really understood them all that well. So, what about those original treatises attributed to Hermes Trismegistus? Well, during the height of the pandemic, I used the opportunity to hide in my study and to dive as deeply into these ancient texts as I possibly could. And also, of course, in the secondary literature and everything that has been written about him. Quite frankly, I discovered that the Hermetica have been badly understood, even by extremely learned scholars, such as the great classicist and Dominican friar André-Jean Vestugère, the author of a massive, dominating 1700-page study on the revelation of Hermes Trismegistus, or his English colleague, Walter Scott, a man who produced this 4-volume translation and edition based on extreme philological and linguistic expertise, in which he, nevertheless, as I regret to tell you, managed to get almost everything wrong. And that's not just my opinion. It was the unanimous verdict of all his international colleagues, including Vestugère. So why those deep and systematic misreadings of the Hermetic literature? The answer is always the same, I think. We are dealing with patterns of deep and partly unconscious ideological prejudice. The Hermetica are Greek treatises written in Egypt. And in the imagination of most classicists at that time, the culture of ancient Egypt stood symbolically for das andere der Vernunft, unreason, magic, superstition, and idolatry. Hermetic philosophy could not be trusted, for it came from Mestre, or the Po Valley. According to mainstream opinion, the sublime philosophies of Platonism and other Greek intellectual schools had been deeply perverted, corrupted by Egyptian irrationality and other occult superstitions. Now, if you read the scholarship carefully, then you discover that great scholars, and undoubtedly great scholars because I have great admiration for their skills and their work, nevertheless, scholars such as Vestugère, Scott, or Reitzenstein experienced the Hermetica as a dangerous existential threat. They saw them as the documents of a fatal decline of reason that had occurred in late antiquity under the influence of alien oriental perversions, reminiscent of fin de siècle décadence and the occult revival in their own time. And so they ended up projecting their own contemporary fears and anxieties about cultural decline onto the screen of the ancient Hermetica. One particularly shocking example that I'd like to highlight here, as pars pro toto, is how they were reading the famous Poimandres, the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum. Authors such as Reitzenstein and Vestigier believed that it told the story of nature as a demonic feminine who sexually seduces the spiritual man of light and causes him to fall into matter. This transparent projection of a biblical narrative onto a pagan Egyptian text was actually grounded in a deeply misogynist fantasy about Eve as the mother of sin. If you carefully read the Hermetic text, then you find, I think, almost the opposite. What seemed like a sinister seduction scene in the minds of Vestigier and his masculine colleagues turns out to be a beautiful and positive story in which spirit and nature are blissfully making love so that humanity may be born from their union. And that's just one example of what I mean by critical hermeneutic analysis, not just of primary sources, but also of the scholarship. Once you become aware of these hidden patterns of ideological prejudice and their often very profound effects on textual analysis and historical understanding, there's really just one solution. You will have to travel to Mestre yourself. You will have to start exploring the Po Valley. You will have to meet the natives. You must learn their dialects. You must study their writings. You must hang out with them. You must listen as carefully as you can to what they are trying to tell you. And so that is what I've been trying to do in this book, my personal favorite, finished during the pandemic and published by Cambridge in 2022. So my conclusion is simple. Scholarly study should not be about what we, as modern academics, happen to believe or how we happen to be looking at the world. Our job is to understand what others believe, why they believe, what they do, how they are looking at the world. And we only ever make progress, I think, in the humanities by actually learning to recognize our own blind spots, by being willing to learn new things that we did not know, so that we can begin to perceive patterns or continuities in history and the world to which we would otherwise be blind. And with that, I'd like to finish my short talk, but not before having expressed my deep gratitude to the Koninklijke Hollandse Maatschappij der Wetenschappen, to the members of the selection committee, and to the group of dear colleagues who nominated me for the great honor of being awarded the Van der A. Oeuvreprijs in the humanities. Yet, although the prize is awarded for my scholarly work, I do not take it all too personally. Most of all, I have experienced it as a sign of public recognition for my field of study as a whole, which includes all my colleagues and students, both in the Netherlands and abroad. Moreover, while I'm deeply grateful to many people who have been supporting both me personally and our field in general, and some of them are present in this room, our program at the university and our international community, there's one person I really want to mention by name at this special occasion, and this is Rosalie Boston, who many of you may not know, but others will know her. Rosalie Boston, who sadly cannot be here because we lost her last February. It is Rosalie, more than anyone else, who made it possible for me and my close colleagues at the UVA to do what we have been doing over the past 26 years. And so I'd like to dedicate this award to her memory. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Wouter, for this very inspiring talk and making us aware that the road less traveled might still be a very interesting one to explore further. So let's see what else there is to explore by you and your co-fellows and students, because I think it's important. And as you say, it's also a recognition of a field that it's time to recognize what's going on there. So very happy with the jury for also seeing that and for acknowledging that. So, so with that, we have come to the end of this ceremony, and I would like to invite you all to join us for a celebratory drink in the rooms, the reception rooms where you also came in. And for all the laureates and all the members of the juries, I would like to ask them to stay here for one group photograph, if that's okay. And again, my heartfelt congratulations on behalf of also of all my fellow board members at the Hollandse Maatschappij for what you have achieved in the humanities. And let's hope that there will be more and more to come, and that this session is also an inspiration for all the younger people in this room and their colleagues who are inspired by everything you have achieved. So thank you very much, and well, let's continue our celebrations next door with a photograph here. Thank you.